Can you hear me?
Yes.
I will warn you that I do have a slight cough, so if I have a coughing fit, don't you worry, I'll get over it and we'll carry on. First of all, thank you very much indeed for inviting me today. I'm delighted to be here. And I know that EFQM is operating and active in many countries and across many sectors. And for me, that's a huge strength. The learnings, I think, that come from different cultures only enrich us, as far as I'm concerned. I would say that, wouldn't I? I was born in Switzerland. My mother was Baltic Russian, and my father was half Belgian and half German, or quarter German. So I do believe in that cross-cultural mix. But in business, as in life, it's always worth having one's assumptions challenged. And there's no better way, I think, than dealing in different geographies. And likewise, I said I know the extent of EFQM's work across sectors. Again, and you heard, for example, that I'm involved with shipping and ports and media. What can they have in common? I use those examples because they are two sectors which I currently chair a company, and also where I was CEO. And the answer, of course, is that across those sectors there are huge differences. But the way that the firms make money, their stakeholders and how they treat them, the context in which they operate, be it financial, environmental or political, and the way they conduct themselves all have huge similarities. So many of the skills required to lead with vision, inspiration and integrity are the same and largely transferable, so long as there is, of course, industry knowledge embedded in the business to help the leader keep grounded. But what does leading with vision, inspiration and integrity really mean? Easy, great words to say, but how can we put them into practice? And I think there are a few ingredients which must underpin leadership like this, which we'll look at, and then look at putting them into practice. For this particular cake of leadership, I think the ingredients include having a strategy and making sure that there is buy-in to that. There are others, but those are two main ingredients I want to focus on today. Developing strategies sometimes relatively straightforward. I'll give you the example of UBM. And UBM used to be called United Business Media. It's the largest independent events organizer in the world, which means that the main part of our business is business-to-business trade shows in sectors as diverse as fashion and shipbuilding. And last year, the CEO announced to the market, to the City of London, that his strategy, which was called the Events First. This was exciting because it was easy to grasp in principle, but it hadn't been articulated before and was simple and clear for investors. That's what we were focusing on, events. At the Port of London Authority, which looks after the River Thames and its estuary, full of complexity and a list of stakeholders as long as your arm, from port operators to politicians, infrastructure builders to rowers, commuters to houseboat owners, strategy development isn't quite so easy. First of all, the data on which to build a strategy didn't exist and needed to be gathered, and the views of stakeholders taken into account before even a start could be made. We're still in the middle of it. So it's not always easy, but it is absolutely the first ingredient. The second ingredient I suggested was communication inside and buy-in to that strategy. How much buy-in, though, you need, I think, is debatable. Probably sufficient buy-in is good enough. It's not 100% buy-in, it's not buy-in by everybody all of the time. It's sufficient to get the job done. And it certainly isn't 100% overnight. And we'll come back to that. So with those two ingredients, the strategy and buy-in into it, we can look further at 5 areas where that leadership with vision, inspiration and integrity can be put into practice. And the ones I'd like to talk about are, firstly, the board culture and the relationship between the CEO and chairman, which of course is something that exists in the UK generally in the public markets, but not necessarily everywhere else. Communication within the business, the inclusion of diverse views and challenge and stakeholder representation in the business, the ability to operationalise the strategy and to make it make sense for everybody in the business to understand how they fit in, and probably most importantly, role modelling by the leaders. So, to the first, that was the board culture and the relationship between CEO and chairman, where those roles are separated. Now, if we believe, which I suspect we all do, that the tone is set from the top, then the board is one place to start to look at the leadership style. And it's with the board that a vision has to be identified. It's not enough to say we want to be the best company in our field in the world. Everybody says that. There must be something more compelling that the board buys into. And the process for doing that is sometimes quite hard. Generally, I think that proposal comes from management to the board for discussion. But it's got to give the board, the management has got to give the board enough time to really consider it, and technical term coming up, chew it over, so that they can really absorb it, get to grips with it, and finding time to do that is essential. It might be a strategy meeting, it might be an off-site, an away day, but I think it's also worth one small, not a trick, but it's helpful every time the board meets to have a piece of paper at the front of the pack, if you like, with repeating what that strategy and what that vision is, so that nobody starts to reinvent the wheel when they meet again, saying, actually, I wasn't quite sure we agreed that, but actually get to agreement, then make it clear and keep it front of mind. And then I think all discussion at board level should indicate which element of the strategy the discussion fits into. So, for example, if you've got, say, 5 pillars to the strategy, one of them might well be about people, then every time some topic about people comes to the board on the agenda, it should indicate that that's why it's there. It should very clearly state that it's part of the pillar, the people pillar of that strategy, and it is a strategic priority. Again, reminder of the clarity. And I do think that people react well to that kind of clarity, because flexibility or lack of clarity in the name of flexibility means people feel quite uncomfortable sometimes. And clear frameworks allow a lot of freedom within them. And if that framework is set at the board, then it can be cascaded down through the executive committee, through other teams, right through the company. But it's in the culture of the boardroom that I think the tone is really set. And as a chairman, I would look for respect and trust above all within the boardroom. Now, respect relies on choosing excellent board members as the first step, who can have a view across the business, that in no way would you expect them, or would you always feel that you knew what they were about to say. You'd always think that they had an interesting point of view because they were there for that breadth. So you don't think, oh, it's Helen again, she's going to go on talking about X. You think, oh, good, it's John, he's going to speak. He always has something interesting to say, whatever the subject. That mutual respect counts for a lot, but it does rely on careful selection of the board members in the first place. Trust was the other thing I said. And I think I would break that down into confidentiality, knowing that the boardroom is a safe place to talk, where you can say things honestly that aren't going to get reported outside. And that requires a good degree of bonding between the board members. That really only gets achieved if they spend time together, probably informally, outside the boardroom, so they get to know each other as people as well as board members. Of course, you can also get a different kind of bonding when the board has to go through a really tough time. And certainly I've been there, you come out the other side much stronger as a group, but it's not always easy to engineer that. It's not actually aimed to have a tough time, it's a byproduct. But all this point about tone has to be nurtured by the chairman, and good boards, I do believe, have to be
like everything that needs nurturing, be it a plant or a flower, it needs attention all along the way. And if you leave it for a little while, let's say it dries up or something goes wrong, and things get off track, they certainly can get misunderstood. And small worries can become molehills very quickly. Sorry, mountains, very quickly. I talked about the relationship between the chairman and CEO, and in the UK, that now is a given that those roles are separated. And it's a very important part of the board dynamic, I think, and a useful piece of UK governance, which is beginning to show up in other countries. And the chair role is one of support, obviously, for the CEO, and being a sounding board, but also being prepared to challenge and to stand firm when needed. And of course, in the end, it's the chairman who will influence the board and the choice of the CEO, the timing of their tenure, and their assessment of her or his appointment. And if the chair is already in place to select the CEO, rather than joining an incumbent CEO, then I think the dynamic can be particularly favourable. Because together they discuss the future, the strategy, how the board can play into it. And over the past 18 months, I've recruited 2 new CEOs into each of the companies I chair. And it is so exciting to see how they develop, how their strategies develop, I mentioned earlier. And in each case, our relationship is good. And I think the board senses that. And that also means that the CEO is open to suggestions, open to comments, not defensive in the boardroom. And I have to stop the outside directors getting too involved in executive matters. But I think it helps the tone that I said about respect and trust in the room. I've certainly been on boards where that relationship is more tense, and that creates a difficult culture, which clearly has repercussions right into the organisation. And particularly where the chairman used to be the CEO, it's still the practice in some parts of the world. But to create that leadership, excuse me, with vision, with inspiration, and with integrity, the board has to function well, in my opinion. The second place we were going to look at putting into practice that leadership is around communication. I referred earlier to buy-in to the strategy, and that's one part of it, because it's very much as much about the how as the what that matters for leadership with inspiration and vision. I was talking the other day to a warehousing company where they had a plan, of course, to be the best warehousing company in Europe. Or was it the world? I don't really remember which it was. But the CEO knew that wasn't enough. He knew it wasn't a compelling story. And he worked hard over years, actually, not weeks or months, and with the help of a very large proportion of his management team, found out that what was amazing about their business wasn't the amazing warehouses they built, but it was the things that went on inside. And so with just a little bit of extra imagination, they realized that the motivating idea for them was that they, quote, make amazing things happen. It's so simple, so motivating, and in the context, so much more than just warehousing. Now at UBM, we can talk about trade shows. Jolly interesting to me, but not necessarily to all of you. And I have a background at The Economist magazine and the group, and with an interest in world trade. What I see when I walk into a trade show is perhaps slightly different from others. Take a food ingredient show. I went the other day and we have mechanisms to find out what a visitor is interested in. And when I was there, one of the visitors, it was clear they were interested in buying 100 kilos of fibre. And we had the means to show to exhibitors who had fibre in their product line that there's an interested customer about it. And quite soon, after negotiation, a contract is actually signed on the show floor. And for me, that's world trade before my very eyes. It's not trade shows, big events and boring corridors. It's world trade happening in front of you. And if I describe the business like that to future employees, generally they find it much more motivating and inspiring than saying they're going to be putting up stands on pieces of carpet. Now, enthusiasm for a business, for serving customers well, for running a tight ship, and all the things that these are all different things that can inspire people. Employees recognise and respect passion, and enthusiasm is infectious, as I suggest is optimism. This just touches on one of the characteristics which we could come back to, on the need for leaders, any kind of leader, for personal resilience, which I truly believe is of huge importance for good leadership. The tired CEO, the exhausted CEO, particularly those who are not admitting it, is much less likely to convey that enthusiasm, that infectious optimism, and much more likely to resort to bad behaviour under stress. And I think that communication also requires a lightness of touch and an overarching sense of humour to be really powerful. I don't mean jokes, especially when times are hard. I mean acknowledging problems and the challenges, but having a sense that in the end, these are soluble and not always, but usually surmountable. There's usually a way around most of the blockages. And a little dose of humility helps, because it is important to recognise when the going is tough. I wouldn't be around media if I didn't think that words were important too, and lightness of touch means avoiding management jargon as well. For those of you who know Lucy Kellaway's column in the FT, you will know what I mean. For those of you who don't, I thoroughly recommend you read it. She is ruthless and fearless in showing up meaningless jargon that isn't only not motivating, but positively demotivating in corporate communications. She does it with humour. It is pretty Anglo-Saxon, and it is pretty biting, but I do recommend it. The other recommendation would be The Economist style book, which is absolutely not about being enthusiastic or infectious, but it is about how to get a message across. It is about how to make sure you have time to craft the short story, not that long, easy thing that you can toss out. It's the short story that distills and conveys the meaning exactly of what you want, without too many adjectives, without jargon, and it also advocates short words, short sentences, and avoiding anything with Latin origin. So one of my particular pet hates is, you must never commence something, you start it. Short words, Anglo-Saxon words. So these are just small examples of some of the ways in which communication can help with conveying the vision and that inspiration to drive the business. I said that the third area was to put into practice that leadership in integrity by the inclusion of diverse views and challenges and making sure stakeholder representation is taken into account. If you're a customer-focused business, getting the views of customers is likely to bring in an immediately diverse set of views, and you have research, and you have focus groups, and so on. But if the business, could that not be done quicker? If the business has a large, say for example, female customer base, how many senior leaders in the business are female? Likely to make the connections before you have to do all the research and go out and spend the money and then wait for the results. I said in the report we have a list of stakeholders as long as your arm. In fact, in our annual review, we publish in very small type at the back over a page of stakeholders whose views we seek and take into account. Some of those views are often very uncomfortable, and they don't make easy listening. And certainly, when you're dealing with something as complex as a tidal river, not all of them can be taken into account, or accommodated even. But we have to make sure that we have the range of everything in front of us to make that balanced decision. And there, we do this with 3 separate public meetings every year, 1 annual general meeting, and constant, less formal engagements, going to meetings of local groups, formalised stakeholder management programme, involving me, the CEO, members of the management team, with specific organisations, specific people with whom they need to keep in touch, both to examine their future needs and to make sure that those little molehill worries don't become mountains. But this needs, again, constant attention. and also the routes for communication back into the organisation. It's not enough for me to go and hear the views. I've got to make sure that there's a proper feedback into the organisation. And acknowledge and deciding whether to act on those views is essential. Again, easy to say, hard to do. And of course, worker participation on boards is commonplace outside the UK. I sit on a board in France where I saw immediately, quite early on in my tenure, the value of elected representatives. We had a presentation on a new IT system. All looked very good, all the outside directors very positive in their reactions. And one of the elected members of staff put her hand up and spoke. And she said roughly, I don't know what planet you're on, we simply haven't got the resources to implement this system. Pretty major point, really crucial to have been brought into the discussion. Outside directors immediately saying, this looks like it's something that needs attention, please take it away, think about it, and bring it back. We avoided a huge risk like that, I believe, and a huge cost, and by having that slightly less mainstream view available to us. So overall, the diverse views now can be uncomfortable. By their nature, they generally come from a different place, and challenge always challenges groupthink, or what the received wisdom is. Some of you may remember some years ago now, I'd say 20, might even be more, we had some riots in London, the Brixton riots. And I recall talking to a BBC journalist who came into one of the editorial meetings at the BBC to find all the management and the journalists and the cameramen being set off in one direction with one line of story. And when he interjected, and because he knew the Brixton community, he was able to say, wrong, not that way, this way, both literally in where you're going, but also in the storyline. And again, another example of saving money and a huge increase in quality by getting the story right, rather than going up, as it were, a blind alley. Not IT this time, but journalism. Again, making sure that those diverse views come in and you listen to them, however uncomfortable. And of course, currently, a good focus on diversity is about women in the boardroom. Women in the boardroom, very good thing, but women at all levels of the organisation is now where the diversity agenda is moving. And that male-female conversation can sometimes feel like talking across cultures. And that's one way to look at it, I think, particularly with men and women at work. To engage across cultures, we know, requires sensitivity, maybe some training, in some way in which managers start to recognise their own unconscious bias. Recognising talent in other cultures is quite difficult. You know that when you get a CV from somebody who comes from a completely different part of the world. The way you evaluate it is really very different from the one that you would look at in your own culture. But it's making sure that you can recognise talent in other cultures and giving enough focus to including those, and in this case I'm talking about female voices in a male organisation, requires attention again. But my goodness, is it worth it? Makes so much value, so much risk avoided if you make sure you include the voices of all the stakeholders and the workforce rather than just half of it. So you can't lead with vision, inspiration and integrity if you don't take account at least of all the, not necessarily follow, all the voices. I believe that for certain. Now, my fourth point was about operationalising a strategy to make it make sense in the business and for employees. To really lead with that vision, inspiration and integrity, it's hard. No one said it was easy, but for everyone in the business to understand how they and their team contribute is an enormous step forward. It won't be a matter of words, it's rather about making sure that the roles and jobs are clear, so that again, people feel that the framework within which they're operating makes sense and has been thought through. I thought, when I was CEO of The Economist, that our strategy was pretty well understood. But when I went across the world to more distant offices, keen to discuss it, I found that the kind of questions I was getting in large meetings were about why the coffee machine didn't work, why the health benefits weren't good enough. Not really questions about the strategy, symptomatic of they didn't understand how their roles fitted in, and symptomatic of feeling vulnerable and very nervous. You cannot underestimate how long it takes to embed and what it requires in terms of energy from the leadership team. And the initial formulation, I think, is a place to start. At The Economist, when I was appointed CEO, I found a boutique strategy firm who were happy to help us develop our strategy for, in those days, about £300,000. Talking to my experienced chairman, rather frugal and thrifty, didn't like spending money very much. I was very pleased to report that I was keeping these costs, I thought, quite low. And he said, it'll never work. Why not? You need to spend at least £1 million for anybody to take any notice. We did, and then from the chairman, who was not known for spending money, and making sure that actually people understand quite how important this is. At The Economist, where business and journalism have church and state divide, one of the questions was whether the journalists would engage with this strategy, which was essentially a business strategy process. It was really important that they did, through their leader, the editor. And I heard from his office that he wasn't going to be able to make some of the meetings we had scheduled for the strategy development. So I took my diary, I went down to his office, made him sit down, went through his diary. When was he going to be free? When could he commit to being at those meetings? So he couldn't weasel out of it. And we moved the meetings to accommodate him, make sure everybody else was there. But it's only making sure that right from the top, right across the top, you have that commitment from the word go. And from that top team is absolutely essential. And then making sure, we've said this before, that that framework that can be communicated down is communicated down. You have to monitor that. You can't just say, communicate it. Did it happen? What gets measured, etc. Make sure that it's going through and you have checks there. Town hall meetings, small team meetings, and everyone needs to know in the end, over time, how their job fits in. Hugely time consuming, but time and time and time is needed. The last point I want to come to is the role modelling one. Role modelling by leaders in the business. And that is about leading with integrity and inspiration. You don't have to be a salesperson, and you don't even have to be an extrovert to do this. But you do have to be yourself, and to stay yourself, I think. Particularly those who get promoted. I think find this occasionally quite hard. I know a couple of things happened to me. I got promoted, my old boss rang, and he said, how come you're so too grand to take my calls? What do you mean? And it turned out that my assistant had said, she's too busy. Now, technically that might well have been true, but her job was to make me seem, at least seem, as accessible as I had been always, and that my door was as open as it had always been. When I became later CEO, my HR director arrived the morning of the announcement and said that her administrator, and I had been in the company a long time, but that her administrator had said, I do hope Helen isn't going to change. And just that simple phrase stuck with me throughout my time, because there are pressures, there are different things that happen, but what's inside doesn't change. And if that integrity and that inspiration is there, that's why you're appointed. Don't let it get lost, and don't let the leaders let it get lost. The things that you found funny before are still funny. The things that you care about may develop, but they're still essentially the same. But I do think you get permission to talk about them more. Some of the things one might want to be advocating in business, you keep a little bit quiet about when you're more junior. once you have a senior role, you do have permission to talk about them. And that is great, and it lets your personality show through. It's also why you were appointed, and that's, I think, one thing to remember. Use it, don't hide it. And it includes opening up a bit about how you are as a person, what happens outside work, and what you're going to need help with. None of us are expert at everything, so showing where you need help will always, always help you get the team on side. And again, I don't think that's usually applauded enough. So that self-awareness is important, and having some basic psychometric tests to help, I think is useful. I can't see you terribly well, but I can roughly see when you put your hands up. How many of you know what Myers-Briggs tests are? Okay, that's a good number. For those of you who don't, these are it's a very long-standing psychometric test that measures on 4 spectrums the kind of personality type. It's not perfect, but it's very useful. I'm an ENTJ, which means I'm extroverted in thinking. Doesn't mean I tell jokes. It's extroverted in thinking, intuitive, thinking, and judgmental, which means having a path that you want to follow rather than options all the time. But it's incredibly useful for me to know that, because many of the people I deal with, particularly, funnily enough, in engineering-based businesses, are the opposite end of the spectrum. Introverted, sensing, which means using data to make decisions rather than intuition, and keeping those options always playing open as peas. I listened yesterday to the founder of Ted Baker, the clothes company, who was describing how next to his desk he has a hug zone. So if you want a hug, you go and stand in this zone. For me, that would just be horrible. I'm absolutely never going to have a hug zone next to my desk, but if he wants it, that's fine. Bit of self-awareness. There are also some missing parts of the assessment, and I've learned through other tests that I had a very low basis for low score for neurosis. One of those things where you see you have a low score, and you go, why have I got a low score? It's a low score for neurosis, which is, again, useful to know, because I don't tend to get terribly worked up. I don't throw things at people or shout at them. Not my family doesn't say that, but my colleagues would say I was almost too calm, and I need to know when I feel strongly about something. So actually being able to know that and say, I need to tell you I feel really strongly about this, articulate it, very useful. So being true to oneself, I think, also requires that level of self-awareness. And to have a bit of help assessing that, I think, is useful. And in another way, integrity can also, of course, be role modeled. From what you claim on expenses, what you declare as or accept as hospitality, these are things that are relatively easy. Some of you may know that at Rolls-Royce, we had some issues that are being investigated by the Serious Fraud Office in the UK. Since then, the CEO and the board have been unequivocal in making some very clear steps to be absolutely crystal clear that there's a code of conduct. We will not tolerate inappropriate behaviour. You might think that didn't need doing. It turned out that it did. And it is clear in every statement, in every report, those sorts of things, part of the role modelling. So there's a signed receipt of that code by each employee, workshops to embed it, and people have left the business. These are all signals, but it's the role modelling that it really makes the difference. Different example, back to journalism. I'm a trustee at Thomson Reuters, which owns what used to be the Reuters news agency, where we have founders' share principles, and these are basic principles by which the journalists have always had to abide, and indeed now all staff have to abide. The principles guarantee something, try to guarantee something really hard, which is freedom from bias in news coverage. It's an extremely difficult concept, but one that Reuters has been known for many, many years. They're principles that have to be lived every day, even when under pressure, for example, from foreign governments, and people who don't, shall we say, wish journalists well. And you can imagine the stories that I was hearing the other day from the Baghdad correspondents, who is now back in the UK because the death threats to him became so serious. But in the end, couldn't ignore them. But his integrity and his role modelling of the freedom from bias principle was absolutely intact. So mostly that role modelling leading with integrity doesn't have to go that far, but it can do. The only other thing I would add is around risk, because how we examine risk is becoming increasingly important. If I look at the case of the port, where we're dealing with water, which is hugely dangerous, and these are therefore potentially life-threatening risks. If we didn't assess this risk, the risks around water, we would not be acting with integrity, in my view. We wouldn't be protecting or respecting employees whose life might be in danger, customers whose investment in big ships might be extremely costly, or stakeholders like swimmers whose rights have to be balanced with those of safety. Tricky stuff. I'll give you some examples. Normally we would have one pilot taking one large ship into port, the large container ships that is. But when these ships started to reach 400 metres in length, 400 metres, we wondered whether that was really still feasible. We assessed the risks with the pilots and discovered that, at least at the beginning, while this got embedded, it was necessary to have at least 2 pilots bringing in the ships. Differently, we had an employee accident where someone was trying to help a third-party boat owner on whose boat we'd been doing some work, very serious accident, which made us think very carefully about whether we could even accept third-party work in future and under what circumstances. And those swimmers, do they really understand the speed of the tide in London, going at 4 or 5 nautical miles per hour when it's coming in and out? And the currents around the bridges in central London? Should they be left to make their own decisions? They're grown-ups, why shouldn't they swim wherever they want? But we have to consider lives as well as the risk registers. Difficult one, but I don't think we've necessarily got the answer right there. So, in conclusion, I'm saying that to lead with vision and integrity and inspiration, you need a strategy well bought into, there's the ingredients, and you put that into practice, that leadership into practice via the boardroom, in the communication, in accepting diverse views, in operationalizing the ideas, and in role modeling. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you.